A young Comanche watches from the rear as the warriors silently approach their enemy. He's nervous. This is one of his first raids. The Comanche are not here because they wanted to fight. This attack is punitive. Retaliation for 3 of theirs that were taken in the days prior. Maybe they're still alive, but the rumors about what these people, the Tonkawa, do to their captured haunts them. As they approach, many Tonkawa are gathered around a fire. Others are in their shelters. They are completely unaware of the Comanche approach. Right before the attack is launched, the band breaks their silence. Their war whoop is loud and fierce, terrifying as it is intended to be. Their target panics and flees. The Comanche warriors follow, cutting them down with arrows in their pursuit. But our young Comanche stays behind. As he approaches their camp, his heart drops as he notices something on the fire. On closer inspection, his fears are realized. Roasting over the flames is the leg of one of the Comanche warriors. Their enemy was preparing to eat him. The Tonkawa were cannibals. The story you just heard was adapted from a portion of 7 Years Among the Indians. It's a pretty credible account from a young white settler named Herman Lehman who had been kidnapped and through his youth became a Comanche. His account of the Tonkawa as man-eaters is far from the only one. In the minds of most, the practice only exists as part of the worst horrors in the human experience. So what would you do if you lived next to cannibals? Let's talk about it. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. But before we get to our story, as a fan of history, one constant piece is family genealogy. We track the heritage of the figures of history all the time. In Comanche history, the role of Peta Nakona and Cynthia Ann Parker play a large role in the life of Quanah Parker, their most famous chief. Their story, like many in history, are not of one person, but of the family. So what is your story? My Heritage, the partner for today's episode, can help you find out. They make building your family's history easy. Sign up and within moments your family tree will expand. You can find ancestors going back generations, all thanks to over 19 billion historical records available. When I was building my own family tree, I discovered images of my great-grandparents that I had never seen before, and I learned about the lives of relatives even further back than that. It gave me a reason to call my grandmother. When I told her what I had found, she was so excited. Then with the My Heritage Instant Discoveries feature, it made even more connections and my family story kept growing. My Heritage also lets you take photos you uncover and bring them to life. They can repair and enhance them, add color, and even animate them. I uploaded this old image of my grandfather on a motorcycle. This bike has been a joke in my family for decades. He tried to teach my grandmother how to ride, and she immediately crashed it into a fence. She was fine, but he was furious and tore up her license. A rather dramatic reaction we all find hilarious. This software helps keep that story alive. It's fun sending people pictures and telling them what you find. And it's valuable. I look forward to connecting more of the dots in my family's story. Start building your family tree by letting My Heritage uncover your unique history. Risk-free. Sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all of My Heritage's amazing features. If after 14 days you decide to continue your subscription, you'll get a 50% discount. Just use the link in the description. You never know what you'll find, but I bet your family will love to see it. Now let's get to our story. In 1862, during the American Civil War, a group of Native American warriors, including the Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage, attacked Confederate Fort Cobb in Oklahoma. Just to the south, along the Washita River, about 300 Tonkawa were camped. After the war party was satisfied with their attack on the fort, they turned their attention to the Tonkawa. Unprepared to fight and essentially unarmed, the raid massacred them. The fields near Washita River were littered with the dead. Left as a bone field, one resident, John Clark, witnessed the sight. He recalled later that skeletons were scattered over the hillside just as the Tonkawa were killed. Nearly 140 men, women, and children were killed. The Tonkawa who survived split up. Some fled south where their Confederate allies could offer them some protection. Others are harder to track. The damage was done. As a small tribe of just a few hundred members, their numbers would never rebound. For all intents and purposes, they were exterminated in the attack. The raiders claimed that the attack was retaliation. The Tonkawa were known cannibals, a practice that after years of tolerating they could no longer let stand. Not after the Tonkawa killed and devoured a Caddo boy earlier that year. If in a town over, there were a group of people that you might go to war with, and you knew this is what they did to their victims, what would you do? Where does cannibalism fall on the hierarchy of war crimes at something like the Geneva Convention? The Tonkawa as a tribe was in a fairly consistent state of low-grade war, much like many of the tribes of the Southwest. Never more than semi-agricultural, competition over resources naturally led to violence. Allies and enemies changed frequently, but their culture had not evolved to practice cannibalism. That was a constant. As a smaller tribe of only around 600 members, if the other tribes wanted them wiped out, why wait to do so until 1862? Why not do it in any of the previous hundreds of years? If cannibalism was so objectionable to their neighbors, why would they have allied with them in just the years and decades before? So maybe it wasn't that. But to draw any sorts of conclusions, we have to know a little bit more about cannibalism and how it was practiced in the Southwest. The Tonkawa practiced a specific form of cannibalism. It is wild to think about, but the practice can be broken up into different forms. They are not an example of survival or famine cannibalism. Horrific examples of that come from well-tread stories. The Starving Time in Jamestown, the Donner Party, the Holodomor, even the Battle of Stalingrad. Famine cannibalism makes sense to us, at least at some level. It's a tragedy. People become resigned to eat a person for sustenance, in an emergency. In the case of a truly starving people, I think on some level everyone can at least acknowledge that it may be a choice they have to make. In survival cannibalism, killing is rare. It's not a form of predation. It's an opportunity. A gift from one of the poor souls who passed before you. Another form is pathological cannibalism. These are the cannibals who have severe personality disorders. Psychopaths. Those who don't function with the rest of us in society. But the Tonkawa were not like Jeffrey Dahmer. Mostly. We have an example in a minute. You can make up your own mind. Mostly, the Tonkawa kind is institutionalized. It's sometimes called war cannibalism, or ritual cannibalism. The practice of eating a person is done as an act of aggression. And it would have to be. The idea of murdering and butchering a victim can't be separated from violence, and serves a ceremonial purpose. That purpose has little to do with calories and protein, although there may be a correlation between the societies that practice it and a protein-scarce environment. It's really about the complete domination of your enemy, or the inheritance of their more desirable elements. Some say it has the effect of making those who ate them more powerful or animalistic. In Herman Lehman's account of the Tonkawa attack, he wrote about one Tonkawa that was being pursued by the Comanche and was fighting back. He killed 2 Comanche warriors in single combat, and Lehman himself seemed impressed. Quote, "It seemed like human blood had made the Tonkawa bold, and somehow our shields would not ward off his bullets." End quote. A third Comanche was able to overwhelm him. But this belief that cannibalism was something worth fearing goes back well further. You can find symbolic examples in the oldest writing imaginable. In the Iliad, Achilles finds himself in an animalistic state following the death of his friend Patroclus. The devastated Achilles draws out Hector, the man who had killed his friend, and stabs Hector through the neck in their fight. In an act of horror, as Hector lay dying, Achilles says to him, "The dogs and carrion birds will tear apart your flesh." Hector pleads with Achilles to accept ransom so that his parents can give him proper burial rites, so that he can move into the afterlife. But Achilles says no. His rage, having made him more animal than man, he says, "I wish the fury and pain in me could drive me to carve and eat you raw for what you did. As surely as this is true, no living man will keep the dogs from gnawing at your skull." Achilles stops short of the act, but in a brief passage acknowledges his desire. There is no further domination to be had than to eat your enemy, even if he stops short and leaves it to the dogs. In the story, eventually Achilles does relent and turn Hector's body over to his father, but the terror that is invoked remains. The rage felt by Achilles and the fear of desecration would be present by any civilization in war who doesn't see their dead simply as a carcass. To reduce a man to the point where he could be eaten would take for many something like a ceremony. Without it, people would feel like an animal. The ceremony creates purpose. It is to inherit the traits that one would desire for war against their enemies, and to inspire that kind of terror in anyone who fears being devoured, a fear justifiably felt by anyone. Almost all ancient civilizations have burial rites and customs. You see over and over again that the mutilation of the dead is viewed as the highest insult, because doing so carries with them over into the afterlife. In that way, they create a pairing that would be horrifying to any enemy that knows what might happen to them should they lose to a cannibal. Most civilizations move away from the practice, many far before the Tonkawa, but not all. The Aztecs practiced ritual cannibalism. They may have even done so at scale. Bernal Diaz, on his campaign with Cortez, wrote about how the arms and legs of victims were to be cut off and eaten. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was looked at by the Spanish with awe, as if it was among the most impressive and grand cities in the entire world. It's hard to imagine a civilization so advanced keeping such customs. They feel like the Klingons from Star Trek, a fierce people, modern in almost every way, but holding on to warrior tradition. Most societies had grown out of their earlier, more violent practices, like cannibalism, infanticide, or sacrifice. It, as a process, likely took millennia. So why didn't the Aztecs and the Tonkawa? I don't know. But the reality is that they were not alone. Accounts suggest both the Lipan Apache, Wichita, Karankawa, and maybe even the Comanche had ritual cannibal ceremonies. Compelling physical evidence for a tribe called the Anasazi all but fully confirms other instances. 850-year-old coprolite shows evidence of human protein and several samples of Anasazi excrement. There is only one way that gets there. And I bring this up because the standard of proof historians have placed on calling someone a cannibal is very high. Witness accounts, unless there are many, like in the case of the Tonkawa, are generally not enough. That is probably a good thing. The taboo around the practice immediately places a black cloud over a whole people. Groups that in the story of history are often portrayed as victims. And fair enough. There are enough examples of propaganda used to dehumanize cultural enemies. It seems like common practice. In the case of a group like the Conquistadors, or Americans looking to expand to the West, dehumanization is a way to take the conquest you want. No one is rallying to save barbarians on the frontier that will slaughter and eat you at the first opportunity. So our modern eyes become skeptical, especially when there is no physical evidence. Accounts are written off as acts of fiction, but maybe an asterisk is more appropriate. A famous example here comes from Christopher Columbus. He wrote of invading cannibal warriors in the Caribbean. Many modern historians made a fairly justifiable assumption that it was a contrived lie, a justification for attacking further defenseless natives. It's not even a stretch. But archaeology has recently given credibility to Columbus's claims, the same way as the coprolite from the practice of cannibalism for tribes of the Southwest. Myths are often not blatant lies as much as they are convenient truths, or at least true enough to offer some sense of credibility. Cannibalism wasn't an unheard of practice in the Americas. It wouldn't have been completely alien to any of these tribes, even if they didn't practice it themselves. Priests in the Spanish mission at San Antonio added to the catechism the question, "Have you eaten human flesh?" That is not there because they hadn't encountered it. So what makes the Tonkawa different? If it's not unheard of, then why would tribes from all around rally against them? I think two reasons. The first is that they were brash about what they did. The Tonkawa were known to wear the finger bones and ears of their enemies as ornaments. Dolls for children contained portions of scalps that had been taken. Several tribes in the Southwest directly associated the Tonkawa with cannibalism, more than anyone else around. Names for them sometimes translate to man-eater. If the same act for these other tribes was highly ritualized, the Tonkawa were open. There is a story from a Texan in 1840. He says that he witnessed the Tonkawa butcher a fallen Comanche. They added the cut-up portions of his body to a large pot with corn and potatoes. They put the pot over the fire, and when the meal was done, they ladled it out, piece by piece, into the hands of each tribal member, and they ate it all as if it was a regular feast. The Tonkawa lacked the kind of ceremony that made this more acceptable to their neighbors. The descriptions make one think they teetered between the ritual and the pathological. But maybe those thoughts aren't correct, or the rumors could be exaggerated. Tribes in the decades prior to the 1862 massacre didn't put them at a distance. The Comanche very famously called on the assistance of the Tonkawa to help them exterminate the Apache. The Caddo had gone on raids with them just a few years before. What changed? Evidence points to the fact that they had become friends with the Americans. That's reason two. Prior to the Civil War, the Tonkawa as a smaller tribe had seen the writing on the wall in regards to the chances of the Indians against Europeans. They cast their lot with who they felt would be the winning side. It's a super interesting part of a lot of these Western alliances. One gets the feel that they are solely based on convenience and what's best for your own group in that exact moment. Westward expansion seemed imminent, and the larger, more powerful tribes of the West were not going to be the ones to save the Tonkawa. By the 1850s, the Tonkawa were regularly used by Texans as scouts and warriors, usually against other tribes or Mexicans. But that kind of thing, alienate you. It's a terrible position. It seems like there is no instance in which they could have made a good choice. Even allied to the Americans, they were still in proximity to the Plains tribes. Unless adequate protection was offered, violence was inevitable. In 1862, conflict between warring Americans and Indians led to Confederate leadership fleeing Fort Cobb. The Tonkawa had initially allied themselves with the Texans, but when the Texans became Confederates, they stuck with them. Regardless, without adequate leadership and protection from the Indian Agency, violence broke out. That is when the Caddo, who were not allied with the Confederates, accused the Tonkawa of murdering and cannibalizing a young boy. Details on this are lacking. The Tonkawa may or may not have been responsible, but that didn't matter. The tribes were too different. They couldn't find a way to get along, and this pushed people over the edge. To other tribes, like the Comanche, the Caddo accusation felt believable, and there were scores to settle. The Tonkawa were accused of cannibalizing two Comanche in a joint raid with the Caddo just a couple years earlier. These are not the kind of times where groups needed a lot of reason to go on a raid. Tonkawa cannibalism was beyond what the other tribes were comfortable with. A new incident has tensions high. Tribes all around the area despise the Tonkawa for their alliance with the whites. And the enemy fort the Tonkawa are camping near for protection currently isn't very protective. It's a tinderbox, and the spark already happened. Joseph Cannoli, in an article titled A Terrible Truth, The Tonkawa Massacre of 1862, explains that the accusation was part of an excuse. Quote, "The Kiowa and Comanche attached the charge in order to establish the Tonkawa as pariahs and scapegoats. For all who heard the charge, it did not matter if the Tonkawa were guilty or not. The common attitude apparently supplied its own confirmation." End quote. This was the convenient time for them to do damage, and they had their justification locked in. Before I wrap this up, there were some things I didn't mention that are worth considering. The Tonkawa had a reputation, and the fact that the Texans were willing to work with them anyway is something worth thinking about. Also, on the hierarchy of worst crimes people can commit, ritual cannibalism has to be pretty high. Because of that, I don't know what to make of the Tonkawa or anyone else with credible accusations. Forgive me to be reluctant to defend the cannibal allies of slave owners. People tend to look at cultures from different times and offer a fair amount of leniency, but it doesn't seem forgivable, at least in a modern sense. So what would you do if you were a tribe in this region, with territory near the Tonkawa? Well, I can tell you what the Comanche did. Remember the story I opened with, where the Comanche found the Tonkawa cooking one of their own? The story continues. They were able to capture some of the Tonkawa that committed the act. What follows is what they did to them. Layman writes, quote, "We scalped them, amputated their arms, cut off their legs, cut out their tongues, and threw their mangled bodies and limbs upon their own campfire, put on more brushwood and piled the living, dying, and dead Tonkawas on the fire. Some of them were able to flinch and work as a worm, and some were able to speak and plead for mercy. We piled them up, put on more wood, and danced around in great glee as we saw the grease and blood run from their bodies, and were delighted to see them swell up and hear the hide pop as it would burst in the fire." End quote. That act was done in retribution, but wasn't one that was outside the norm of behavior for what would have been done to a captured enemy. And this is not about Native Americans. There is no shortage of horrific examples committed by Europeans or any other people of the world. Endless acts that make your skin crawl. So you can decide for yourself where all of this lands on your hierarchy. But that's enough for today. This was a pretty dark one. I'm gonna go hug my dog. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please feel encouraged to like it and subscribe to the channel, and send in ideas for what you'd like to see next.